one last line I want you to remember, especially if you're sitting in a fluorescent-lit cubicle, right? Now with someone like that boss breathing down your neck, it's this. When power is abused, expose it. But do so with a plan, with patience, and with the knowledge that the real victory is the life you rebuild after the wreckage. If you love hearing stories where cheaters, liars, and power-hungry bosses finally get what they deserve, then hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss what I'm about to tell you. Now, let me take you back several years to the time when my life got entangled with one of the most arrogant, controlling men I've ever met, my boss. He wasn't just a boss in the professional sense. He was the kind of guy who thought he owned the air you breathed. An extreme type A personality, the kind of man who believed nothing happened unless he willed it to. And the worst part, he enjoyed playing with people's lives like it was a sport. At first, I just thought he was a tough manager. Strict, overbearing, demanding. But the longer I worked under him, the more I realized he wasn't just tough, he was toxic. His favorite hobby wasn't fishing or golf or working on cars like normal men. No, his hobby was women. And not just being with women, he had an ego so massive he needed to document it. He liked to take photographs of himself with his conquests in the act, if you catch my drift. I know what you're thinking. Surely a married man wouldn't be so brazen. Oh, but he was. He was married to another employee in our company, and yet he had zero shame. He'd show off these disgusting trophies, his photos, on the production floor, snickering, bragging, treating them like trading cards. The guy was reckless, arrogant, and worse, untouchable. At least that's what he thought. Now let me explain how he and I really came into conflict. Around this time I had started seeing a young woman from another one of our offices. It wasn't casual, it was turning serious, even though it was long distance. I was careful about it, but somehow my boss found out. You see, that was a problem for him. Not because workplace romances were against company policy, though he could have pretended to care about that, but because in his twisted little mind, everything was a game, and I had broken some imaginary rule of his. He liked to control people, their relationships, their reputations, and when he realized I had something he couldn't control, he set his sights on destroying it. I didn't know this at the time, of course, but my girlfriend told me later how he came to visit her office. He cornered her, tried to charm her, tried to get her into his bed. She told him no, flat out no. She wanted nothing to do with him. That should have been the end of it. But men like him don't take rejection well. When she spurned him, he went on the attack. He fabricated lies, whispered poison into the right ears, and before long, she was fired. Just like that. Her job was gone. Her income vanished, all because she didn't want to sleep with the boss. When she told me what had happened, I was furious. Furious doesn't even begin to cover it. I wanted to storm into his office, scream at him, throw a punch. But I knew how men like him worked. Anger only gave him more power. I needed patience. I needed to outsmart him, and I needed to hit him where it hurt. And here's the thing about arrogant men. They always leave a weakness exposed. I knew his weakness. Those damn photographs. He couldn't keep them at home, of course. His wife might stumble across them, and then his house of cards would collapse. No, he kept them at work, locked away in his office. He was careful, yes, but not careful enough, so I started watching. Waiting, planning. Patience became my closest friend. Every day I went into work and saw him strut around like a king, smirking, barking orders, casually ruining people's lives for sport. He thought he was untouchable, and that arrogance of his was the very thing that gave me strength to wait. I couldn't risk rushing this. One false step and I'd lose not only my job, but my chance to make him pay for what he did to my girlfriend. And I refused to let him win. The first time I thought about those photos, really thought about them, I felt almost sick. What kind of man did this? Not just cheating on his wife, but cataloging it, bragging about it like some perverse trophy hunter? But the sickness I felt quickly turned into focus. Because if I could get my hands on those pictures, I could bring his entire empire crashing down. Now, breaking into his office during the week was impossible. He was rarely out, and even when he was, his door stayed locked. Security was decent enough to keep prying hands away, but weekends were different. Sometimes the plant ran overtime, and sometimes the cleaning crew came through. I made a point of volunteering for overtime shifts on Saturdays. No one questioned it. I played it casual, like I just wanted the extra pay. But in truth, I was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. It finally came one quiet Saturday afternoon. I was working through some drawings in the main area when I heard the familiar jingle of keys and the shuffle of footsteps. The cleaning lady, an older woman with kind eyes, had arrived. She moved from department to department, unlocking doors, tidying, emptying trash bins. And then, I heard it, the sharp click of a lock turning, right down the hall. My boss's office. I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. This was it. My chance. I didn't sprint down the hallway. That would have been too suspicious. Instead, I grabbed a rolled-up blueprint, tucked it under my arm, and walked toward his office like I belonged there. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure she could hear it. When I got to the doorway, she was already setting down her supplies. She gave me a polite nod. "Need something?" she asked. "Yeah," I said smoothly, holding up the blueprint. "Just need to take a few dimensions real quick." "Won't be long," she shrugged, unfazed. "No problem. Just close the door when you're done." That was it. That was all the permission I needed. She left, her cart squeaking down the hall toward accounting, and I was alone. I shut the door behind me and turned the lock. My hands were trembling, but my mind was crystal clear. The office smelled faintly of his cologne, an obnoxious, musky scent that made my stomach turn. His desk sat there like an altar to his arrogance, papers stacked neatly, a computer humming softly. And there, on the right-hand side, was the drawer I'd been dreaming about. I moved quickly but carefully. No time to waste. I pulled the drawer open. Files, invoices, nothing incriminating. But I knew better. I dug deeper, sliding folders aside until my fingers brushed something thicker, heavier. I pulled it out. A stack of photographs, bound together with a rubber band. 4 inches tall. My breath caught in my throat. I slid the band off and fanned them out across the desk. And there he was, my boss, in all his disgusting glory, posing, grinning, caught in the act with not one, not two, but multiple women. Every shot had his smug face in clear view, and not one of the women was his wife. Some had dark hair, some red. His wife, a blonde, I almost laughed. He wasn't just arrogant, he was stupid. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the mountain of evidence in my hands. Years of his depravity, his betrayal, his arrogance, all cataloged in glossy, undeniable detail. I didn't hesitate. I stuffed the entire stack into my bag, slammed the drawer shut, and straightened everything just as it had been. Then I took one long breath, unlocked the door, and walked out like nothing had happened. The cleaning lady saw me in the hall. "All finished?" she asked. "Yep," I said, forcing a calm smile. "Thanks," she nodded and kept moving. And just like that, the trap was set. I didn't strike right away. That would have been reckless. No, I waited again. Because timing is everything in revenge. And I wanted him to feel the full weight of what was coming. And when the time was right, oh, it was glorious. I'll never forget the hum of the engine as I drove out of the plant that night. A dozen glossy pictures taped inside an envelope under my jacket like contraband. The fluorescent lights still buzzed in my ears. My hands were steady on the wheel, but there was a concrete, cold calmness behind them. Nothing theatrical, no triumphant whoop. And I had to keep my head clear. This had to be clean, precise, irreversible. I drove to the town where he lived. It was the kind of place with one main street and a post office that still smelled faintly of paper and stamps. I remember thinking, maybe irrationally, that doing it in his own hometown would be poetic. I parked a couple blocks away so no one would see me loitering near the post office. I walked in, held the envelope like it was nothing more than a bill, bought stamps and sent it. No return address, no handwriting that could be traced, nothing. The only trace would be what the photos themselves revealed. Walking back to my car, I felt a lightness that I hadn't felt in months. Months of planning, of waiting, of swallowing my anger so I could be smart instead of stupid. But the job wasn't done the moment I mailed the envelope. I knew it would take a few days for the mail to arrive, and then a few days after that for whatever dominoes I set off to fall. So I went home, fed myself a sandwich, and tried to behave like nothing had happened. I told myself to be patient again. Patience in this game was its own weapon. 2 days later, the factory grapevine started whispering. Office gossip has the odd property of moving faster than any official memo. At first it was just tiny things, people making assumptions about HR meetings, someone mentioning the boss's wife calling in sick. Then on a Monday, the rumor that made people stop working mid-shift started. Mrs. Hargrove had filed for divorce. Not a rumor anymore, someone had actually seen the papers. The news hit like a clap of thunder. When the magnitude of it hit me, the reaction was mixed and complicated. There was a burst of vindication, sure, that warm, almost ridiculous satisfaction that comes when something you planned actually works. But there was also a hollow part of me that felt a little raw. I hadn't wanted anyone to suffer in a vacuum. I'd wanted justice, not malice for malice's sake. Still, I tried to keep perspective. He had systematically destroyed people's livelihoods and reputations for fun. He'd used power as a weapon. This was not about vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was about exposing a predator. Then came the details, the kind that make the corporate world look small and petty and, at the same time, very real. Mrs. Hargrove, let's call her Laura, had handed the photos and a carefully worded letter to her lawyer. Her divorce attorney was ruthless in that way high-powered lawyers are when they smell an easy win. He combed through company expense reports, travel logs, and small financial loopholes. The more he dug, the worse it looked. The photographs were only the first slice. They opened a door into a pattern of entitlement and secrecy. The court filings weren't pretty if you were him. Accusations of infidelity, misappropriated company travel, professional misconduct. Things that at first glance might have looked unrelated started forming a pattern. Laura's lawyer used the pictures not just as proof of affairs but as part of an argument for willful professional misconduct and moral turpitude, language that sticks in a man's professional record like glue. When the judge reviewed the filings, it didn't look good. People at work noticed the change immediately. The boss who'd once glowered like a man who owned the place was suddenly quieter, smaller somehow. He stopped coming in early. He stopped sneering at the production floor like a man delivering verdicts. Eventually, he stopped showing up at all. Rumors flew about him being suspended while the company's HR department conducted an internal review. Later, a terse memo announced his termination. They called it a restructuring. We called it karma. The fallout at his house was worse. Laura packed a car with what she could and left with the kids. Her lawyer hammered out a settlement that took everything from him: assets, reputation, custody protections for the kids, and enough cash to start over. The divorce settlement included punitive financial terms. The court didn't look kindly on someone who'd behaved in such a cavalier, exploitative way. Credit lines were cut, partners left, and the people who had smiled and nodded at the boss in his better days turned their backs when the news made it into family circles. Word got back to me that he confronted Laura, yelled, pleaded, begged for something akin to forgiveness, but she walked away. I heard it secondhand at first. She told him she'd seen the photos, the proof, and that she wanted no part of a marriage built on betrayal. He tried to gaslight, to charm, to control. All of it failed. And when he got physical, if the stories I heard were true, he learned that the shield of his power couldn't protect him at home the way it had protected him at the plant. Someone who had been the hunter outside suddenly found himself alone inside a house that was no longer his. Reception of all this varied. Some people congratulated me. Some whispered that it was a dangerous game to play. There were a couple of co-workers who looked at me with a new wariness, as if checking to see whether I was the kind of man who would take extreme measures. I knew the lines were blurred. This wasn't charity, and it wasn't a clean courtroom victory in which everyone walked away unscathed. But as the dust settled, what remained was that a man who had used his rank to groom, manipulate, and humiliate others no longer had the power to do it. For that, I felt justified. And then something happened that made the whole thing feel personal in a different way. My girlfriend, my reason for patience and planning, was offered her job back. Laura's lawyer had ensured that the company reinstate anyone who'd been wronged by the boss's misuse of power. HR, under pressure and scrutiny, had to scrub a bunch of decisions and make things right on paper. My girl walked back into her office like a queen reclaimed, and I watched as the relief in her eyes washed through her face. No amount of money would replace what she'd lost, but being given back the dignity that had been ripped from her, it mattered. We didn't celebrate like in the movies. There was no champagne, no grand scene. She hugged me quietly in a parking lot after her first day back, and for a long time we just stood there. I think she understood in that hug all the planning, the waiting, the moral calculus I'd wrestled with. The revenge hadn't healed everything for her. It couldn't. But it had removed one of the knives from her life, and that counted. The boss never returned to the plant. His name was gradually scrubbed out of the company directory. People who had once feared him began telling their own stories of being belittled and demeaned, and in doing so, they helped paint a fuller picture of a man who'd been more predator than leader. The company put in new training, new oversight, and a new code of conduct. It felt small in the face of everything that had happened. But it also felt like progress. The system had, in some way, corrected itself. There's a quiet satisfaction in watching consequences unfold that you set in motion, but there's also the awareness that you're a small part of a larger push toward justice. I didn't become some superhero. I became a man who refused to be passive when someone I cared about was hurt. That choice, simple and stubborn, is the one that defined everything that followed. After the dust settled, life crept back toward normalcy. Though the seams of my world had been sewn together in a different pattern, my girlfriend and I took it slow. We rebuilt trust, partly in each other, partly in the idea that we could choose better than the people who'd hurt us. She had her job back. I had a different kind of job to do, to be present, to listen, to not let the bitterness infect the relationship. We moved carefully, like people who had been through a fire and were testing whether the new growth would take root. We talked about marriage in practical terms, about what we wanted from life, from each other, and the boundaries we would never cross. We argued like everyone does, but our arguments were usually shorter, less cruel. There was a mutual respect that had developed in the aftermath. She appreciated that I'd put myself on the line without making everything about retribution. I appreciated that she was brave enough to come back to the same place she'd been wronged and face it head on. One night, months later, we sat on my small back porch and she reached across the table, grasped my hand and said, "You did what needed to be done." The pictures were cowardly evidence for a cowardly man. I didn't need a medal. Her words were enough. She laughed softly and said, "So, want to make this official?" I said yes. We didn't make a spectacle of the wedding. No big show, no overblown vows. Just family and a handful of friends who had watched us survive. We kept things small because we both wanted the solemnity of a promise, not the noise. Standing there with her, I felt like the version of myself who'd been patient and steady finally got his reward. A life built on honesty rather than power games. But I'm not the kind of man who thinks every battle ends clean. The memory of that boss and his swagger stayed with me as a cautionary tale. I joined in every conversation about workplace conduct I could, quietly pushing for better oversight where I could influence it. I wanted to ensure that our little corner of the world wouldn't foster another predator who could warp careers like toys. Some people called it meddling. Others called it responsibility. For me, it was about preventing a pain I'd seen firsthand from happening to someone else. Years later, sometimes a former coworker would call up just to share that their new manager didn't behave like old times. People seemed less willing to tolerate the kind of arrogance that had once stalked our hallways. Maybe that was my doing, maybe it wasn't. But the culture shifted enough that my kids, when we had them, wouldn't need to inherit that kind of fear, and life moved on. The boss's name receded into a chapter. His face, once a fixture of whispered bravado, was now a faint shadow. My wife and I had kids, moved houses, and had the dull, wonderful rhythms that make a life. Soccer practice, parent-teacher conferences, quiet Sunday mornings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. One thing I learned through all of this was that revenge can take many forms. People imagine it as fireworks, spectacular and loud. But the revenge that lasts is quieter. It's the slow undoing of a predator's access to power, the restitution of dignity to wronged people, and the building of a new, steady life that doesn't need to scream triumph to be true. There were nights, especially early on, when I'd revisit the moral lines I'd crossed. Taking the photos, mailing them anonymously. These weren't clean legal moves. They were risky and they could have backfired. I thought through every alternative. I considered lawyers, HR complaints, formal complaints that might get caught in corporate red tape. But in the end, the photographs were proof of a pattern that would have taken a long time to unravel through channels designed to protect the company as much as the victims. I chose efficacy over process. I don't tell you this to encourage vigilantism. I tell you this as an account of a man who made a hard moral choice, who weighed options, and who accepted the consequences. The result was that someone who abused power lost it. That to me felt like justice. If you've listened this far, here's the short version you can hang on to. I saw a wrong, I planned, and I acted. My actions were not about cruelty. They were about exposing a predator who thought his privilege made him untouchable. A dozen photos, a stamped envelope, and a lawyer with a grudge was enough to tip the scales. It's a simple sequence that looks messy from the inside, but from the outside reads like a line of cause and effect. And now, the advice I promised, the real meat you can take away whether you're dealing with a manipulative boss, a toxic partner, or anyone trying to use power against you. Be patient, not reckless. Waiting to act doesn't make you cowardly. It makes you strategic. Emotion can sabotage the best intentions. Think, plan, and act in a way that produces results rather than drama. Collect evidence ethically when possible. If you can document wrongdoing through official channels, do so. If those channels are corrupted or slow, be careful about the route you choose. Anonymity can be a tool, but use it wisely because it can harm innocence if wielded without thought. Protect the vulnerable first. My first priority was to make sure my girlfriend didn't get further harmed. If you're in a position to safeguard someone who's been wronged, make that your first move. Don't let rage be your only guide. There's a seductive pleasure in imagining spectacular revenge. Real victory comes from removing a harmful person's power and rebuilding your life, not from escalating the conflict into chaos. Focus on rebuilding, not just retribution. The sweetest victory is a life well lived afterward. Build, heal, and teach. Those ripples last longer than the momentary satisfaction of seeing someone fall. The boss is a cautionary tale now. My wife and I made a life together that's steady and honest. I kept my hands clean enough to sleep at night, and I used the fallout to plant new seeds, both in my family and in my workplace. That's what I think of as the proper measure of revenge, not how loudly you can shout when someone falls, but how gracefully you can stand on your feet afterward. If there's one last line I want you to remember, especially if you're sitting in a fluorescent-lit cubicle right now with someone like that boss breathing down your neck, it's this. When power is abused, expose it. But do so with a plan, with patience, and with the knowledge that the real victory is the life you rebuild after the wreckage. And if you want more stories like this, real people, real consequences, real justice, don't forget to hit subscribe. I've got more where this came from.